In February of 2019, I was very fortunate to be able to deliver our CA18 Charlie Mike Romeo to its new home in Motueka. The first leg of my route was from Tauranga to the western bays of Lake Taupo. This overflew me over Tokoroa and part of the Waikato River. I had a crosswind from my left quarter of about 10 to 15 knots in places, but the ground speed was still pretty good as I had a very slight tailwind component in that crosswind. For navigation, I use my iPad, which is loaded with Air Navigation Pro. Here you have some still shots of the Waikato River as it tracks its way towards the Whakamarumaru Dam. Ground speed 83 knots. Indicated airspeed was varying from 75 to 80 on the dial, depending on what turbulence I was in at the time. As I got closer to the western bays of Lake Taupo, the tailwind component picked up a little bit more and the turbulence calmed down, and I was able to get up to 90 knots ground speed, which is quite good for a Cub, and I was still indicating about 80 unfortunately though. The iPad shows the Lake Taupo to my left. To my right is all the expansive hills and country going back towards Tamaranui, and as we pan around to the left you'll start to see Lake Taupo, or the western bays of Lake Taupo over top of Tihoi come into play. In the distance, Ngauahui and Ruapehu, just as you can see off my nose now, are just starting to become visible. The wind was still coming from an easterly component, so I was expecting to get some rough turbulent conditions going past Ruapehu, as you can see by the cumulus cloud layer that's actually built up. I also decided to start climbing. It's time to get up and get some height between me and the ground so the mechanical turbulence would not be quite so severe, because it's quite rough terrain on this part of the leg from Western Bays to Wanganui. I set a cruise climb, basically maintaining about 70 knots to get up to 6,000 feet, which put me around about 350 feet per minute in the climb, and still maintain 70 knots on the ground speed. Just going past Ruapehu. Ruapehu is hidden behind this layer of cumulus cloud. We'll come around it and you'll see a bit more of a shot of Ruapehu, but it's still covered. There's quite a lot of cumulus cloud around, and I couldn't obtain any more than 6,000 feet in places. I had to actually drop back down again, and as I dropped down I was then getting into the effect of the turbulence from the wind blowing over Ruapehu. So that's Ruapehu, completely covered in the top part of it with cumulus cloud. The still shots are just of the same. As you can see, you've got 79 knots on the ground speed there on the GPS. At this point I started to let down because I didn't want to get into Ohake airspace as I was approaching into Wanganui, but this was a bit of a major mistake as I got beaten up quite badly by turbulence, and in the end I had to actually climb back up and then jump into Ohake airspace. We now landed. It was a nice landing in Wanganui where I topped up with fuel. Took 43 odd litres, 43.08 litres to get from Tauranga to Wanganui, which I thought was pretty good for a Cub. And then from here I had a little bit of a pilot rest stop and then loaded back up again and headed on our way for the next leg, which was from Wanganui down to Kapiti Island, Mana Island, across to the Brothers, down the Marlborough Sounds and into Nelson. Airborne again off Wanganui, off 1-4 grass from Wanganui. I'm tracking the coast down south towards Kapiti Island or Paraparaumu. I'm at 800 feet, enjoying the nice smooth air, and the winds were not as favourable, but we were still maintaining a good ground speed. Out there is the South Island somewhere in the haze. So we're getting 79-80 knots at 2,500 RPM, and at that point I'm just over 1,000 feet, and ground speed's just up there about 76. So all in all pretty good. It was a lovely flight down the coast. There was no turbulence, blue skies, blue sea, and all was going well. Flying conditions going down the coast was represented by the smile. At this point I needed to go out to sea, my first taste of good sea, because I needed to stay outside of Oahakea's military zone. Once I was past the military zone, I could then cut back into the coast, but I decided to stay between off the shore somewhat and inland from Kapiti Island, because I had other aircraft, one over Kapiti Island and one on the shoreline tracking in the opposite direction to me. I also opted to delay my climb. I was originally going to climb to 6,000 feet from this point before I crossed over the channel. But looking at the water, there was no wind lines on the water representing the low level winds that were predicted. So I opted for 2,300, 2,400 feet and crossed the channel at that height, and it was very smooth with just a very slight headwind. At this point I've just gone past Kapiti Island and I'm heading to Mana Island. Mana Island was my waypoint to jump off. That's Mana Island right in front. This was my point where I was going to turn right and head for the South Island. So one last look at the North Island with the Cub, and there's the South Island in the distance there, just sticking through the murk. It's about 17 miles across, 17, 18 miles from Mana across to the South Island. There's a final check of all the T's and P's. The engine was running fine. Life jacket was on at this stage, which I put on at Wanganui, so it was time to turn right and cross the Cook Strait in the Cub. The skies were blue at this point. There was no cumulus cloud around. It was just the haze. The haze that you can see is actually from the fires that were raging in Nelson at the time. That layer of haze over top of the whole of the South Island, that was what I was plagued with once I did get across. I was able to cross over at a reasonable ground speed as well, so it didn't take too long to go from Kapiti across to South Island. South Island now is just starting to come into view. This is called the Brothers. It's just a point that we pick on the top of the South Island. I'm indicating 79. I was indicating 79, 80 all the way across. I'm at 2,400 feet. It's quite pretty when you actually start crossing over the coast. This is going into the Sounds from the Brothers, and this is called the Marlborough Sounds, and we have the Queen Charlotte Sounds a little bit further up. Once I'd crossed into the Marlborough Sounds, the weather, as predicted, changed. This is when I was wanting to be up and around the 6,000 feet mark. The wind was coming from the west now and swirling around and coming down the Sounds. As you can see it on the water down below there, you can see the wind lines on the water. Even though I was indicating a good speed, I was starting to lose ground speed, so 80 knots roughly on the airspeed indicator was getting down to 70. Very pretty landscape through here, going through the Sounds. It takes your mind off the ground speed that you're not achieving now, but well, look, we're still looking at the airspeed in the higher numbers. In the foreground, you'll start to see the cumulus cloud that's been forced up by the fires in Nelson. From here it's uphill. I just set a cruise climb and try to maintain about 400 feet per minute climb so I could get up to about 6,000 feet. In the end I think I capped out at about 5.5, and at 5.5 the turbulence was starting to settle down and become a little bit more comfortable. Ground speed, unfortunately, at certain parts of this leg got down to, the lowest was about 56 knots temporarily, but we were averaging about 60 to 63 knots. It takes a long time to climb up to your altitude when you're only travelling at a fairly low ground speed and the airspeed. But you don't fly a Cub for speed, you fly it for the loveliness of flying a Cub. And it was all part of the journey. I really didn't mind. It was 2.5 hours from Tauranga to Wanganui, and at this stage it was going to look like another 2 hours or a bit more than 2 hours to get to Nelson. Here we are, just about at the last part of my climb. I'm up to 5,100 at this point, 61 knots. There we go, dropping down to 58 knots ground speed. And on the iPad here you can see I'm still in the sounds area, getting ready to cross over the ranges. 80 knots was average, between 75 and 80 knots was average at this height, but as I said, the ground speed was not reflecting the indicated speed by any manner of means. It was quite rough over this part, and I decided that I would just rough it out. You can see the cumulus cloud. I was above the cumulus cloud, so I was also had in my mind is that at some stage I'm going to have to get down, so I didn't want that cloud to all close up and turn solid, so that I couldn't get down, as I could see in front of me now across the ranges. At this part of the journey, the turbulence was starting to get a little bit much. Sometimes it was dropping down 300 to 400 feet per minute and climbing back up at about 200 or 300 feet per minute in the turbulent troughs. In the foreground was some of the last of the Marlborough Sounds before I started to cross over into the ranges. I did also notice that the cloud was starting to build in places around here. This is quite light little fluffy cumulus cloud, which is quite pretty when you see it in little bits, but you don't like it when it's solid white, like what was looking like in front of me on the ranges. As I got closer to the ranges, as predicted, the cumulus cloud was starting to thicken up. I had some holes in front of me, some large holes, so I wasn't too worried, but the ranges directly in front of me were quite covered in quite a layer of cloud. So I had an escape plan. My escape plan was to turn left and fly down the South Island somewhat more until I got under the cloud and then come back into Nelson. But as it turned out, as you can see, this has now dropped down into Nelson here. Nelson's out to my left here. I was able to find a hole and I come down through Pippin Island. Some more shots of looking back at Nelson with the orange tinge from the smoke from the fires. I was unable to cut through Nelson airspace due to the 23 helicopters fighting the fires and going around in the circuit. So I opted to help out the controllers and myself by going out to sea again. So it was a longer distance across there than it was the Cook Strait, but eventually I crossed over and was able to join and land at Motueka Aerodrome. It's very brown down here at Motueka Aerodrome. You can see why they have a fire bans and stopping a lot of the agricultural work down here. Those hangar group down there, I think the second from your left was going to be the hangar that the Cub was going to live in from this day forth with the new owners. It's a lovely aerodrome. I encourage anybody to come down to Motueka. It's a good alternative to Nelson Aerodrome. It's got a nice grass runway as well as a sealed runway. Some of the last photos I will get of my Piper Cub replica, our adventurous CA18 Charlie Mike Romeo here parked at Motueka Aerodrome. You can see my safety gear I had stacked into the back seat to replace a passenger for making the crossing over the tiger country and the water. Total hours I've flown in the Cub since its first flight was 140.6. A good number of hours before you hand it on to the customer, and a good trip of 5 hours that it took me to get from Tauranga to Motueka. So she passed all reliability tests a lot on this journey, and so I have no hesitations to give it to the new owner. Thanks for watching my journey from Tauranga to Motueka. As I said, total time was 5 hours exactly from Tauranga to Motueka, and that's not including the stop time on the ground at Wanganui. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish the new owners, which is our family that has bought the Cub, all the best, and I hope they have many enjoyable hours flying the Cub like I have had, and all goes well for them.